Again, hi everyone. Really nice to be here. I've been sort of listening to the esteemed speakers so far who've gone so brilliantly under the hood about what and how what makes AI and AI in general and AI agents tick, how to incorporate it in your workflows, and how to come up with maybe new workflows altogether. And especially Maria's talk right now on hallucination, I think flows beautifully into what I want to sort of discuss today. um, I want to take a step back and look at what comes, and that is essentially going to be the focus of my talk here. Look at what comes before we write even a single prompt, or connecting a single load or node, or even write a single line of code. My talk today is about empathetic, resource-aware agents for the next billion users. And like I briefly said, I've spent most of the last 5 years building for these users, first at Airtel and most recently at PhonePe. But when you say next billion users, immediately what comes to mind is your emerging markets, your sort of developing countries like India, but many others. But I want to stress on that this is not a talk about just those sort of emerging markets. I mean, it's really a talk about all of us, right? It's a talk about what happens when users trust starts from zero, and that's really where a lot of these users are when it comes to engaging with AI, and even more in terms of engaging with AI agents. So the next billion users in my mind is a metaphor for the next billion skeptical users in each of our sort of own markets. Our friends, our parents, our clients, our colleagues, and anyone really who's encountering autonomous AI for the first time. And resource aware is not just about data. It is also about an agent's awareness of the real resources that matter, our money, our privacy, our reputation, our safety. So this talk, I think, is what I think is a blueprint for an architecture that builds empathy and awareness for these resources directly into the agent's core. Because really, I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's software, it's lines of code, right? So they don't really feel empathy. So you have to build it in a way that the AI agent and the underlying system sort of understand and operate from that place of empathy. So I want to focus on these concepts, and by design, I will sort of minimize the use of what I think is jargon, which sort of scares a lot of people who are encountering AI and working with AI, starting to work with AI agents. So I'll try and keep sort of this talk, very simple, easy to understand in English. Yeah. All right. So typically with AI agents, you have what I call the sort of the universal autonomy dilemma, right? These we spoke about these skeptical users, these next billion users. They have a deep sort of irrational fear, right? We've seen it in sort of movies, all the time. Is the fear of what I call the autonomy dilemma. What happens when you sort of, hand over the keys, hand over the reins, hand over control, or at least some semblance of control to AI and AI agents? It is a financial threat. The runaway shopper. You ask them to find shoes, it'll buy $200 shoes. It is the privacy threat, right? You ask the AI to sort of summarize your inbox, and it includes a confidential mail that was not supposed to be summarized at all. As a safety threat, right? I mean, you have a smart home that misinterprets I'm cold, and it turns the heat up to a dangerous level. So it's really a talk about the core problem of trust that any sort of user who's encountering AI, working with AI, or hopefully interacting, engaging with AI, is the core problem of trust, right? That they sort of inherently are fearful of it. So how do we solve for this problem, right? How do we build for these skeptical users? My thesis is that empathy, like I said, like I briefly alluded to, it's an architecture, right? We have to sort of define what empathy means in the context of agentic AI, right? It's not a personality, it's not a feeling, it's not just a friendly tone of voice, right? Because all of those, while important, they're not sort of um, they're not the key to what we're talking about. It's empathy in this context is essentially a technical function. um, it is an architecture, right, of governance that hard codes awareness of those real resources that we spoke about: money, security, safety, privacy, directly into the sort of the agent's core, into the sort of system prompt, if you understand what that means. You cannot build an friendly AI and just hope it behaves. You cannot just ask it to be friendly, and you can't just give a system prompt that, hey, be friendly, be empathetic. All right, it can, in that, if you just leave it at that, it can sort of emulate what empathy would look like, what friendliness would look like, what trustworthiness would look like. But really, it may or may not understand what that empathy really means, what that sort of alludes to. So you must architect it to be trustworthy. And I know it works because I had to build sort of a deterministic prototype, for this exact architecture. Yeah. So the prototype that we made is a sort of a real world governance engine, is what I'm going to call it for the purposes of this discussion. And of course, it's some of this data, some of this information, I'm sort of anonymizing it in terms of, because some of it could be proprietary information. But yeah, nonetheless. So when I was helping scale now the Indus App Store to now over 100 million devices, we were not just sort of dealing with skeptical users. We were dealing with market, which the first question would be like, why should I trust you? There's a total, by you're sort of super new to the market, you're asking me to sort of trust you with the stuff that you have on your platform, and getting users to download and install apps, which is, if from the get-go, we are sort of operating from a total crisis of trust, if I will, right? For these sort of users, data is a direct proxy for money. An autonomous sort of app download or an app update, the most basic functions of our platform, was not a feature, but it was potentially a direct financial threat. You don't want to be in a situation, or at least the users thought that, hey, I don't want to be sort of in a situation where the sort of AI, the app store ends up downloading and updating all my apps, but essentially ends up using all of my data, which would have a sort of direct financial impact. In other words, to simplify, to a certain extent, while users were obviously are sort of very excited to try new stuff, a large part of our user base, and again, this thing, you don't need to sort of think of hypotheticals, right? You can just think of your parents, your people who are slightly aged. There's an inherent fear that they have that, hey, what if this button, or what if this functionality, what if I pressing this button sort of causes me some harm, some financial losses. So there is an inherent fear. They're operating from a place of fear, and it's our sort of responsibility to help them overcome that fear. To a certain extent, you cannot build any sort of new or innovative features because we had not solved this fundamental problem of trust. So before we could build an engine, we have to build the brakes. So we have to build a technical architecture whose sole purpose is to sort of assuage their fear, was to prove to the user that, hey, we would respect your sort of high stake resources. And what I call we built a real world governance engine. And this sort of engine operates on 4 layers. And go through all of them one by one. Yeah. So the first layer is essentially the policy layer, what I call the contract. The very first step was not to build a smarter algorithm, it was to surrender control, or rather give control back to the customer, to the user. We built what I call the policy layer. I mean, this is essentially the contract with the user. It's the promise that we make to the user. All right. It is the technical foundation of what I refer to as empathy. Because instead of guessing or predicting, or rather even more dangerously deciding what the user wants, it ingests the user's sort of explicit policies, turning abstract rules into, hey, don't spend all of my money, or any of my money ideally, into sort of machine readable constraints. It asks for the rules that the user wants the AI and the system to sort of respect first. In our prototype, this was simple. Right? We gave users a clear sort of ingestion layer of policies. Only use my data on Wi-Fi. Only run sort of data-intensive tasks during off-peak hours when I'm more likely to not be using my data at all. Right? Always ask me before a last download. Never ever spend any money before getting a double, triple confirmation maybe. And in the broader AI world, obviously, this is the architecture for any resource. The user must be able to set the policy, never spend, let's say, more than X dollars or any money without asking. Never share data from this confidential folder, from this HR folder, or it's never share any proprietary information. Or and in the I think the smart home context, never unlock the door after 10 p.m. Without asking for the password. So this is the first and the most important layer in any case. Well, all of the layers are equally important, but yeah, the policy is the contract, it's the promise. So you don't want to be in a situation where you break that promise. Right. The next layer is what I call the orchestration layer, the awareness. All right. So, hey, you need someone, the contract, like I said, is sort of useless without an enforcer. You need, a system, a layer that sort of orchestrates the entire, the engine. So the second pillar of our architecture is the orchestration layer. This is essentially the brain of our governance engine, right? It decides. Its primary job is not to perform the tasks, but that's in fact, if you really think about it, that's relatively simple. Its main job is to decide, bases all of the inputs, bases all of the constraints, that when it is safe to act, when what is the right action to be performed. And this, again, like in the sort of prototype that I'm discussing, this, what we did is a deterministic sort of on-device policy enforcement engine. I mean, its job was not to be aware. Its job was to constantly sort of poll the device state, validate it against the user's ingested constraints that we spoke about in the first layer. First, it would sense the environment. Am I on Wi-Fi? What is the time? Is the device charging? What kind of network am I on? What is the quality of the network? Next, it would compare that context to the user's policy that we spoke about in the first layer. That what, again, given the user's constraints and given the current conditions, what is the right sort of path? What is the right decision that we want to follow? Then it would decide that, okay, wait, we have to wait right now. That's not the right time. We have to proceed. It's safe to perform the action, or we have to ask for permission, or we need more additional information. And only if the action was compliant, it would act. So this is sort of the technical function, of empathy and awareness, right? It is an agent that is architecturally bound to respect the user's defined resources. And I'm stressing on that again and again. It's essentially the org interceptor, if you will, of the entire governance OS. I mean, the contained AI agent, it forms an intent. For example, I plan to purchase $200 shoes. So from XYZ website, right? It validates the plan against the user's policy that, okay, is the cost under in the what the user's constraints are. Maybe let's say it's trying to buy $200 shoes, but the shoes with the user has very clearly said that, hey, $250 is it's way too much, right? So it's a clear violent policy violation. It might ask you for explicitly that, hey, are you sure you want? I'm going to take this action. It will circle back to the user. Is that okay? So there's always, you have to have the a confirmation layer baked in, right? So the orchestrator might decide to wait. It might decide to proceed, or it might actually decide to, no, this is not the sort of right action, and it queues up a response for the user. So essentially, because you have to prove to the user that it's obeying the rules, right? All right. So next layer, again, very, 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 very important, is the feedback loop, or the proof. All right. We have our policy, which is essentially the contract layer. We have our orchestrator, which is essentially the brain, the enforcer layer, right? But it's not enough, right? A user is skeptical by sort of nature because it does not, trust a black box. You must provide sort of visible proof, a validation on, and in slightly technical terms, an audit log, right? The third pillar of our architecture is the feedback loop. So this is what I'm going to call the trust building engine, right? The job is fairly simple, that it's to visibly prove to the user that, hey, the agent is obeying the contract. It is obeying the rules of the game that you've outlined. In our prototype, again, this was a simple sort of proactive notification that, hey, following your off-peak policy, your update will run at 2 a.m. to save your data, just as you requested, right? A simple sort of validation, a simple proof, a simple sort of visible artifact that, hey, that there's nothing to fear about. I'm going to perform the action just as you wanted, requested, right? In sort of other terms, it's essentially the audit and compliance layer, right? Its job is to provide a transparent, human readable audit trail of the orchestrator's compliance. The simple notification isn't just it's not just a simple notification. It's almost an ally, right? It's almost the reassuring hand on the user's sort of shoulder, that it's the compliance log that proves that, hey, the contract is being honored. There's nothing to worry about. It's not just the AI static response, it's the government. So it's again reporting on its actions, that, hey, I've taken these actions autonomously, but basis the constraints, the rules of the game that you had sort of set. So it's not just I found shoes, it's following your policy, I found these shoes, right? It proves that the sort of the enforcer layer, the orchestration layer that we previously spoke about, uh, it's working. It's working how it's supposed to be working. But there's obviously one final piece the architecture needs, all right? Because if you really think about it, the policy layer, which defines the contract, the orchestration layer, which decides that, hey, when and how should I take that action? And then there's the actual sort of the feedback loop, the audit layer, that, hey, this action was performed. This is how I performed the action. But what is the one final, I think, again, the most important final piece that the architecture needs? This, you essentially establish the system as your ally, as the user's ally. But what if the ally sort of, it does not act how it's supposed to, right? So the fourth and most important layer is the override layer, or the break, or it's the fail-safe layer. All right, this it's probably, like I said, it's the final and most important pillar of this whole architecture, is the interruptibility and fail-safe layer. It's the brake pedal. It's the sort of non-negotiable component that guarantees interruptibility, which is a core tenet of safe AI governance. An agent that cannot be stopped is not an assistant, which you really want it to be. It's almost a liability, right? The user always must have a clear, immediate, and completely effective brake pedal to stop any autonomous action at any time. Right? And this is the ultimate failsafe. It is the component that makes a user feel that, really, sort of believe, that makes it safe for a user to grant trust in the first place, knowing that they can essentially pull the plug when is what them gives the confidence to let the agent run. It could be a simple sort of cancel download button, right? It it works by sort of tying the entire piece and giving the user back the sort of assurance that, hey, at the end of the day, the key is in your hand, the handbrake is in your hand, you can pull it at any time, to sort of act as an interrupt handler. Let's say the user, sort of in the example of autonomous shopping agent, let's say the user approves the purchase. The agent begins a complex multi-step action that, okay, I'll find I'll ingest the user's request, or let's say, again, I want to buy shoes. It'll search across the web, probably use some multiple search engines, multiple sort of e-commerce platform, log into one of the platforms that it decides that, hey, it's the best one. It selects the product that the user wants to buy. It enters credit card information, enters the user's address details. But so in this context, the override layer is would be sort of a persistent cancel transaction button that sits outside the agent's UI. When the user hits it, essentially the governance OS doesn't ask the agent to stop. It kills the agent's process and revokes. It's an absolute sort of non-negotiable. If anything, you can actually design it to go absolutely interrupt handler, that by you can revoke its AI tokens for that session. Essentially, it's an absolute sort of non-negotiable failsafe that, hey, like in the physical world, buttons are buttons, but pulling the plug just kills everything. So this is essentially the complete architecture, how I've defined, of empathy. Again, a policy to set the contract, an orchestrator to enforce it, a feedback loop to prove that it's worked how the user wanted to be, and an override layer to guarantee control in terms of if in case anything sort of goes awry. Yeah, I mean, so the result is, establishing, with this, my assertion is you'll be able to establish a foundation of trust. What was the result? It worked, right? And we were able to neutralize the trust deficit, which is prerequisite for scale, right? The more you sort of scale it, you'll always have your early adopters who are excited in terms of trying the newest, shiniest technologies that come in. But really, as you scale, as you sort of reach out, once your product hits a certain scale, once your parents, your friends, colleagues, people who are not sort of early adopters, who, if anything, are sort of the skeptics, uh, it's a prerequisite for scale, right? It's not just a chart, it's a proof that the 4 pillar governance model is a viable sort of scalable solution for a mass market platform. But at the end of the day, it was just a prototype, right? It's not just a one-to-one analogy. I mean, now where we are in the whole AI space, like the entire industry is building what I think is the black box model, all right? So essentially, it takes inputs from users. There's essentially a black box, and it performs sort of actions, right? It's architecturally and fundamentally, if you really want to look through the hood, you have to be sort of very, very, you have to be aware of, you have to be informed, you have to be smart enough to really dig, open the hood and dig deeper. It's not open, it's as far away from open as possible. It's very difficult to sort of look at the trace, look at the audit log, and to figure out what's happening. It's architecturally and sort of fundamentally untrustworthy. You're at the mercy of these sort of closed loop models. So black box, like I mentioned, right? I think my assertion, my core belief is that this is a wrong approach. There needs to be sort of, you should always have an intermediary layer. I mean, the current, in my humble opinion, but the current layer is user inputs, governance OS, which is essentially our 4 pillars that we just sort of talked about, contained AI agent, which results in a contained AI agent, and then sort of autonomously taking the action. It's the layer that sits between the user and the agent. It enforces the policy, runs the orchestrator, provides feedback, guarantees an override. But how can the simple, you might be thinking that, okay, this entire your prototype was deterministic, and how can the simple sort of system govern a complex non-deterministic AI that is probably prone to hallucination? Again, call back to Maria's session just before this. I mean, this is the entire point, right? The governance OS doesn't care why the agent fails. It doesn't care that if the agent's intent is malicious, careless, or based on complete hallucination. It's trying to prevent. It's not trying to prevent the hallucination itself. That, I think, is an LLM research problem. It's designed to neuter the impact of the hallucination that can be solved to various extents using RAGs, memories, better system prompts, etc. Now, the entire idea is that putting a container around the agent and force it to pass through all of these high-stake intents, whether they are brilliant, flawed, or fully sort of confabulated through the deterministic checkpoints of the policy and orchestration layers. If the agent hallucinates, the orchestrator doesn't debate it. It just checks the sort of the user's policy, blocks the action. Right? The hallucination is rendered harmless. This is how you sort of, in my view, make an untrustworthy black box safe enough to use. What started as an architecture to govern data for data pure users, I like to believe that it's now the essential blueprint for governing any high stakes resources for any skeptical user. We must stop trying to build empathetic agents. In a way, there is no such thing as an empathetic agent, not in the traditional sense of the word. Well, not yet, at least. We don't know where it will be 5 years from now. But instead, we must build a governance system that, and governance OS almost, that enforces empathy and trust at an architectural level. And the agent then is just a component inside this trusted container. I know we are sort of short on time, but there's an analogy that, I think I came up with this just today, right? I mean, it's not a radical, this entire governance OS stuff is not a radical idea. All right. I'm probably giving a name, slightly different name to it in the context of AI and AI agents. It's an architecture that we already trust with our lives every single day. In fact, think about your car. Most of us are rightfully terrified of a fully autonomous black box, but we all use partial autonomy without a second thought in our cars. because you trust, because it's a trust first architecture. It's not a black box, right? There's a speed limit. There is which is policy. There is, when you, let's say you're using cruise control, right? There's a speed limit, which is the policy layer. There is the orchestration layer, which is essentially the cruise control, the agent that senses the car in front, right? The feedback loop, which is the dashboard, the alerts, the beeps, the whole speedometer, all of that stuff. And of course, you have a literal brake pedal as the override layer. So we must stop sort of building AI agents like black boxes and start building them like cars with a clear, transparent, and interruptible sort of governance OS that puts the user literally in the context of cars, and metaphorically in the context of AI in the driver's seat. I mean, last few words. I mean, the future of sort of empathetic and resource-aware AI is not in the personality itself of the agent. It's an architecture, and we must stop building black boxes and start building the governance OS that makes them trustworthy. This is, in my view, how we build empathetic AI for the next billion users. Thank you very much. That was me. Obviously, love to connect over LinkedIn if you have any questions. Feel free to drop me a connection request, drop me messages. Happy to take any questions about how we are solving some of these problems in the real world. That's really it from my end.
Wow, that was great insight, Rohan. Appreciate it, and looks like you're doing an amazing job with whole empathic AI, because that is what is needed. And I also love the fact that I think the containerized agents will be another layer. I mean, that's how we have to kind of control them, right? Otherwise, they'll go out of control. One agent will say, "Hey, I want to date you," other agent, and there's going to be out of the loop. So no, this is great. Appreciate it. We got a lot of people, almost 8,000 people watched it live. That was amazing. They
Thanks,
were
Mahesh. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and everyone just connect with Rohan on LinkedIn and ask any questions. Looks like you're doing an amazing job. With that said, we'd love to get you back on other shows. We do a lot of these shows and webinars on all these new tech, and we'd love to get you back on the show sometime.
I'd be delighted to be back.
Thank you, Rohan. Bye.